If you want your hair drawing to look like this, but it ends up looking like a blob or a piece of cardboard, you've come to the right place. Welcome to our hair shading tutorial series where I teach you how to shade hair. In part 1, I'm going to show you the basics of rendering hair. In part 2, I'm going to show you how to render and color hair with different hair colors. And part 3 is going to be covering rendering different hair textures. So let's get started with part 1. So if you don't know how to draw hair, you can simplify them into ribbons. Now, how do you draw ribbons, you may ask? Well, you can start off with cylinders. For this example, I'm going to be drawing 2 cylinders. I'm going to space them a little bit farther apart just so that there's some distance between them. For an extra challenge, you can draw more than what I have here. And I just draw ellipses and I connect them with 2 lines, and then I can go in and connect them in any way I want. So I can connect them in a very loose way like this, or I can connect them in a more wavy way, which is using more S-curves. And this is basically a ribbon in a nutshell. It's compound cylinders. I'm going to add one more curve up here, and that is just going to be my other cylinder that I won't draw. And there you got a ribbon. So now the next step is to turn this into hair. And for the sake of this demo, I'm going to erase these little lines here because this is just our construction. And I'm also going to erase all this and that. And when we turn this into hair, a few things will change a bit, but the overall shape of this ribbon will stay the same. I'll be duplicating this one more time, so I'm going to make this smaller. I just want you to see the process so it's really easy to tell what I do here. In fact, I think it's better that I actually make this look like a full-on ribbon rather than just it's missing sides. I always make sure to add the underside right here, so just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to add this little extra bit of shading in here. And to turn this into hair, all we really need to do is add a few extra things. I'm going to erase this really lightly here. I'm using this as my base drawing right here because I can always change this as I go. I know that this video says it's a hair shading tutorial, and why am I, drawing hair right now? Well, the reason is shading problems are actually drawing problems. That's something that I learned, and I wish I learned sooner. The reason why you can't shade hair well, or you find it hard to shade hair, is because you don't actually understand the form. And what drawing does is to clarify those forms for you. So if you can show in your drawing that you understand how a ribbon works, and it's basically, hair is ribbons deconstructed, it'll be a lot easier to render. So what I'm doing right now is I'm separating these areas into different clumps. You'll notice that I'm drawing like a bunch of overlaps, or like a little bunch of like curved T shapes. And this is super important for drawing hair because hair is not a flat dimensional, it's not a flat shape or flat piece of paper like a ribbon is. It has a lot of layers in it. So the more you add layers, the better it will look. And this also gives you information of how to shade the hair because, you're going to add shadows and stuff, and you're going to add extra details that you wouldn't have added if it was just looking like this. So really take the time to think about how you are going to separate out these strands. You'll notice that I'm separating them out into different groups. I have one big group here, a small tiny group right here, and a medium-sized group. I'm also adding in, the back side of the hair, and so on and so forth. So this takes a little bit of time to get used to. I'm also adding some extra strands on the outside to give it a nicer silhouette. And so that is just going to make it look even more like hair, and it's not going to look as, ribbony. I'm also going to break up the shapes if I really feel like it needs it. This is all subjective. You don't have to do what I do. Everybody has like a different design sense. The most common things that you'll see in hair, however, is overlaps, turning edges, right? You'll notice that when I'm adding, when I'm showing the turn of the form, I'm adding some extra texture or lines just to show that, hey, there's movement in here. I'm doing the same thing here, and I'm kind of showing like the form lines in an invisible way. It's kind of hard to describe, but you'll see what I mean when I shade this all in. I also make sure to add some nice twists and turns, so that means showing the flip side underneath the ribbon right here. So there's multiple ways to draw a ribbon. You can draw a ribbon that is just showing one side like this. You can have a ribbon that is turning up and you're showing 2 sides. 1, 2, and you can also twist the ribbon and show 2 sides as well. I think adding twists is super important for drawing hair in general. That's basically what I'm doing for the most part. And my favorite part is just drawing a bunch of twists and turns and showing multiple sides. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, more than, just more than 2 sides. The more we see different sides of this ribbon, the more dynamic it's going to be, and that's how you're going to get nicer looking hair. So once again, be sure that if you want to know how to shade hair, you got to know how to draw hair. And this takes time, but as always, this doesn't have to be perfect. You basically have every day to learn how to draw. And we're here to guide you for that. All right, so we've drawn a nice lock of hair or a nice clump of hair, and you'll notice that I did not draw all the strands at once like this. This is not about drawing every single strand ever. This is about grouping strands. Hair is design. You're being a stylist for this lock of hair, or you're being a stylist for your character, and most of the time you're working with clumps rather than individual strands. So now that we know how to draw this ribbon, we're going to shade it. But before we shade all this, let's talk a little bit about shading cylinders. I have this little diagram here and I have these little tick marks here, and I'm just going to show you briefly the 5 different components of what goes into shading a cylinder. You have your turning edge, you have your lit side, your core shadow, your shadow side, and then you have your ambient occlusion. So if you have all of these, you got a rendered cylinder, and you also can render ribbons this way. So I'll show you how to do that. So we have the ribbon on the left and the hair that we drew on the right, and let's go ahead and fill this in with the base tone. So here I just filled this in with a light gray. You don't have to make this light gray, you can make this as dark as you want. And the next step is to add in your light source. Now please don't skip this step. If you do skip this step, you're not going to know where your shadows are. This is mainly to show where your highlights and your shadows are going to be, and you can place them wherever you want. I place my lighting system really simply. I like to place it at about a 45-degree angle on the top, right, or the left, and I'm going to do the same thing for this ribbon right here because I want to show you the similarities of how you're going to shade this. So now that you have your light source, you're going to mark out your core shadows. And what is your core shadows exactly? Well, it's basically the separation between light and dark. And this is going to show your lit side, this is going to show where your dark side is, and it's basically the separation between the two. And this part, or the core shadow specifically, is going to be the area of the highest contrast. So I like to place it where the form is actually turning away from the light. So the light source is going to be up at the top, and generally all the areas that are going to be going towards the light, like these bumps right here, is going to be in light. The rest is going to fall off into shadow. So I am going to place my core shadow, my first core shadow, down here. And if it helps, you can also think of this ribbon like a wireframe. If you don't know where to place your shadows, I really suggest actually just drawing out the form of the ribbon and just trying to understand how it's turning in space, right? This doesn't have to be super accurate. You'll notice that I need to actually change this curve a little bit more like this. And it should look kind of obvious, but it might be a little bit difficult if you've never done this before. You'll see that this line is really showing the form of this ribbon, and any part where it's turning away and going down in space, I'm going to put my core shadow. So once again, I'm placing it up here, down here, and another one down here. And I'm also going to place another core shadow at the bottom of the ribbon here because this part is probably going to be pretty dark as well. And now I'm also going to do the same thing for the other side. So we're going to look at this ribbon right here, and we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to add in our core shadow, and you'll notice that when I'm adding my core shadow right here, I'm actually drawing some bumps on top of the hair. I'm doing this to show form. For a ribbon that is a little bit flatter and doesn't have as many overlaps, it's going to be a little bit smoother. But for something like this, it actually will really help you if you add the little bumps and ridges that the line travels across. So that's going to really help a lot. There's definitely going to be some core shadow down here, and I'm also adding in the form alongside of it. There's going to be a core down here, a core down here, and there's multiple ribbons happening at the bottom right here. So I'm going to add one core shadow here, one core shadow down here, and you'll notice that there are different heights because these different strands are, maybe higher than the other. So I'm making this core shadow a little bit higher and making this core shadow a little bit lower. And once again, just going to do the same thing on this ribbon here. So it's really all the same thing. Now, if it helps, you can also think of it like a laser scanner, you know, that you see in the movies, or I don't know, maybe do they have these nowadays, where you'll see like there's like a security scan and the laser is like traveling all the way down to the body, and it will like the laser will wrap around the form of the body to show that, you know, it's them, right? So I like to think of drawing the wireframe of the hair like this as well. So now let's add in the shadows. I'm taking a hard brush and I'm marking out all the areas in shadow. Don't make this this is going to be way too dark for this light color of a ribbon here. So I wouldn't go super dark. I would probably stay at like a medium gray. And I'm just marking out all my shadows, not thinking too much about hard or soft edges at the moment. I like to start off with hard edges right now because it kind of keeps the confusion away. I think soft edges kind of distracts people because it looks fancy, but I like to start off with hard edges because it's just really easy to see what's going on. So this is starting to look a little bit more like a ribbon. We got a lit side, a shadow side, a lit side, a shadow side, and a lit side and a shadow side. And we're going to do the same thing for the hair here. So really try to be kind of methodical about this. This is going to help you to shade hair later on in the future, especially when we cover the process of coloring hair and painting it. So I'm just adding them all in areas where I marked out the core shadows, and I'm gonna bring it up here. There's gonna be a core shadow down here, a core shadow down here, and another core shadow. Not core shadow. There's just gonna be the shadow side down here as well. Inside of the bottom side of the hair is also usually going to be in shadow. So now this is starting to look a lot like hair. It's starting to, you know, you're starting to actually get it, right? So now after that, we are going to add in our core shadows. So all we're going to do for the core shadows is I'm going to use a soft brush, and I'm just going to mark out where the core shadow is and make this part a little bit darker than my shadow side. The reason why the shadow side isn't as dark as the core shadow is because the outside environment is affecting the shadow underneath. So if this were purely in a black background, you would not see this at all. It would actually just be pure black. But because this is in a white background, the white is bouncing off onto the shadow and making it a little bit lighter. So this might take a little bit of time to get used to, but that's basically the reasoning behind it. I'm going to continue adding these core shadows right here. Once again, I'm making these pretty dark, and I'm using this soft brush to really show the form of the cylinder. If you use soft shadows everywhere, it's not going to really feel soft. It's just going to feel kind of blobby. So that's why I start off with hard edges like this first at the bottom, and then I go in with a softer brush and kind of just soften the edges and blend it. This is the same thing as blending it. So after I add in the core shadows, I'm actually going to add a slight gradation right at the bottom here. So as it travels down to the shadow, maybe it gets a little bit lighter before it gets really dark again at the bottom. And there we go. And the other thing that we're going to add, now this actually looks a little bit dark, so I might lighten this up just a tad bit. There we go. I feel like that feels a little bit better. Actually, let's make just a tad bit lighter again. Sometimes I tend to make things really dark just to show a point, but I think that lightening it up actually works a little bit better. And now we're going to take this darker shadow and we're going to add a turning edge. So the turning edge is a way that artists show more to the form on the edges. So this is just giving the illusion that there's a little bit more going on in the back, as if it's rolling away from us. If you don't add it, it's going to look flat, but if you do add it, it kind of gives that extra touch. You'll see it a lot in, like, you know, rendering skin and stuff. You'll see it like on a lot of anime artists where they add the legs, or where they add turning edges on the legs and on the arms and so on and so forth. So this is a very common technique that you'll see when rendering things, adding the turning edge. And there we go. If you want to add extra spice to this, you can also add in a highlight or specular on the very tippy top of the curves right here. This is if you want it to be a little bit more metallic, but I think that this looks really nice. All right, so we have the ribbon shaded. Now let's move on to the hair. Now this is going to get really fun because this is where we can show a lot of texture. So I'm going in and starting to add shadows in different parts of the form here. I'm not thinking about core shadow right now because that is for a little bit of a later part. Right now, I'm using my shadow side to describe all these overlaps. This is how we're going to use them. We're going to take the shadow side and we're going to add, bits of pockets of darkness to show more of what's going on in the hair. Remember, you're not trying to describe everything with line work. You're trying to also describe things with painting and shading as well. This is the point of rendering, is you're describing things. Now this looks really flat right now, so I'm going to go in with my base tone and I'm going to round all this out, and I might go in and mark out some extra shadows on the inside. Once again, this is just to show the texture, so you can see that just by adding a few extra dynamic shapes inside the shadows and then in the light, this is actually looking a lot more like hair. So we're trying to use the ribbon on the side here as reference for this hair rendering. And I'm not going to go too much into detail with this or else we'd be here forever. So I'm just going to add in the most important bits. I like to add a lot of gradation, especially where the shadow is curling away from the light. So especially this part here, that's kind of like where your core shadow is. I like to do that here and maybe describe a little bit more of a different shape in the lights and the shadows. And we're going to describe more of how to do this in the later parts of this video. Right now, I can't get too ahead of myself or get too excited. All right, so there's a very simple light and shadow block out. I just carved out some more interesting shapes, and let's add in a little bit of darker darks or some of our core shadow. If you want, you can just kind of slightly dust the edge of the shadow with a slightly darker dark. This is kind of like showing the core shadow right here on the ribbon. And if you want to blend this a little bit more, I like to take this shadow color and kind of just soften the edges a bit, just kind of blend it in a little bit more, just to make it a little bit seamless. But I like to see a bit of texture in there. That's more of a personal preference. I'm also going to add a little bit of darker dark, or a little bit of the core in this bottom part of the ribbon right here. I'm going to add some down here as well. And this can give me a little bit of a chance to add a gradation from the top of this cylinder down to the bottom, where it gets a little bit lighter and then gets darker again as it goes away from the light. So we see this nice extra shiny ribbony effect. And I like to add core shadows basically right after the highlight, because this is going to show the highlight really well. And you don't have to add a lot. You don't have to add like a straight line like this. This is too blunt. I like to use a little bit more of a subtle touch. And this is just to, once again, show a little bit more and pop the highlights out just that much more. I noticed that I may have made this a little bit too dark, so I'm going to lighten this up a little bit. And for some final touches before we move on to the next part, we're going to add a little bit of highlights just right on the top. And there we go. So that is how you shade hair in a nutshell using ribbons, and I hope that this part was helpful for you. I know that if I knew this sooner, my hair renderings would have looked so much better. I'm going to use a little bit more I'm going to describe the form down here a little bit more. Add in some extra strands, indicate the ribbon form. And there we go. Now that you know how to shade a ribbon and also shade hair like a ribbon, I'm going to show you my favorite process in painting hair that will work for the rest of the videos to come. So once again, if you decided to skip up to part 2 and part 3 and you're lost, please watch this video first, because this is the foundation of what goes into the next videos in the future. So this is what I'm using. I'm using a 4-value system, and I have a highlight value, which is a light gray. I have a base tone, which is kind of like this, like 60% gray. I have my shadow tone, which is much darker than that, and then my darkest, which is my darker darks. And I will be using this for this little demo here. This is kind of like a recap, so I'll be speeding this up. I'm starting off with a quick drawing. This is just to establish my gesture, and I'm going to be filling this in with my base tone here. I say base tone because we're not really working with color. I will cover how to color hair and choose colors in part 2 of the tutorial series, so be sure to look out for that. So the main purpose for this step is to only focus on the graphic shape or the silhouette of the hair strand. It's not about the details, but the overall picture. I find that this helps me with working faster because if the shape works well in this stage, it'll still work when I add in the forms. When I add in the shadows, I figure out how the hair is twisting and turning, and I'm adding the shadow at the bottom part of the hair strand where it's twirling back and forth so I can see that really clearly. And then I also make sure to add in a light source so I know where to put in my shadows. And I just treat it like a ribbon once again. I use large brush strokes to figure out the lit side and the shadow side just to make things easier. I think all this is really just to organize the values and to organize, what side's in light and what side's in the dark, and things will become a lot easier after that. So you'll notice that I'm adding a little bit of a darker gradient closer to where the highlight is. That is just to show some contrast, and I'm also using some of my extra darker values to actually show more detail in what the hair strand is actually doing, because I don't want this to just be like a flat shape. I want there to be a little bit more for you to look at and grab onto. So that's why I'm also pushing the values a little bit darker. For me, I tend to actually make things a little bit darker out of habit, but that's because I think my tastes change over time. So you'll notice that as I proceed more throughout the drawing, I'll actually darken the highlights a little bit and actually make the hair just overall darker in general. But overall, the concept is all still the same. I'm still adding my shadows, and I'm adding in my forms and stuff like that. And I'm also taking the chance to add some extra strands to improve the silhouette. So as I'm working on this hair strand, I'm continuing to add more to it. I'm thinking, okay, what will serve the hair strand well, what will not, and it's all really kind of just experimentation as well. Another thing to keep your painting a lot more organized is to understand controlling your values. So what that means is making sure that your values don't go too light or too dark and in too many different ranges. You'll notice that for my second, third, and fourth values, they're pretty close together, but the highlight is much brighter. So there's a part at the bottom of the hair strand where I feel like there's not enough clarity. So I'm going to actually change the shape of this a little bit and actually use a slightly lighter value to push the top side of this strand out so I can see a clear lit side and a shadow side and where it's actually turning. So sometimes what I'll do is I will push things out with different values. So like if I want something to be shown in light, I'll make it a little bit lighter. If I want it to be shown like turning and getting darker, I make it darker so that it's very clear of what's going on. After I have my main shadow and all that stuff figured out, I then add my highlights, which is usually the last step that I do before my finishing touches. And all I'm doing for the highlights is just taking my highlight value and placing it in the areas where the curve is, coming towards the light. And I love adding the highlights because at the end, more specifically, because it really makes the hair shine a lot more. And it's the only spot where it gets really bright, at least for this specific hair strand that I'm doing. I make sure that, as I mentioned before, that the majority of the hair is pretty dark, but the lightest will be the highlight, and that is great for dark hair in general. Now to add more volume for this, I'm actually going to add some strands in the back of this hair strand that is significantly lighter in value. I noticed that if I see hair strands behind the main clump and it's a lot lighter, it kind of creates an illusion of depth, which I think feels really nice, and you can try it out for yourself. Now to make the hair a lot more shiny, I'm going to add some darker darks in areas that's close to the highlights. You'll see that I added it right before and a little bit after the highlights, and that's to make the hair a lot more shiny without much effort. And it also creates a lot of extra depth that I wouldn't have had if I didn't add this tone right here. Now you'll notice that I haven't even zoomed in yet, and that is more of a force of habit. I tend to not really zoom into the drawing until much later, and that is more to fix certain details like you see here with the highlights. I find that if you zoom in way too fast, you will tend to get tunnel vision, and I think that working broad, like just kind of overall zoomed out, will help you a lot in fixing that kind of perfectionist side. I find that adding finishing touches and just zooming in later works best for me. But of course you can do whatever you want. And all I'm really doing is just adding finishing touches. I'm clarifying areas like in the shadows, making some areas lighter than others, pushing things back and forth, and it's really just a matter of adjustment as always. So that is it for part 1 of this hair shading tutorial series. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that this gave you a better idea of how to shade hair like ribbons and just having a process like this. So as always, if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, and check out the links in our description if you're interested in anime art school or our books. And that is it for me. Anyways, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.